In the distant and forgotten ages of the universe before, the Imperium of Man had even set its first foundation stone. Before the Eldar had begun to weave their paths through the stars, there was a war. A war so terrible, so vast, that it shook the very fabric of the heavens themselves. This was the war in heaven, a battle between gods and kings, fought not with swords or shields, but with the light of stars and the death of entire worlds. The Necrontyr, an ace as old as the stars themselves, had once been much like any other, full of life and ambition, though a great bitterness lay deep in their hearts. Their homeworld circled a dying sun, and the light that reached them was cold and poisonous, making their lives short and full of suffering. And so it was that they gazed up at the stars with envy, for across the heavens other aces flourished, and none more so than the Old Ones. Now the Old Ones were ancient, even in those days, masters of the materia, and it was said that they could shape reality with a mere thought. They lived long and well, under bright suns and in rich worlds, while the Necrontyr withered in the shadow of their cruel star. This envy turned to resentment, and resentment into hatred, until finally, the Necrontyr set their sights upon the Old Ones, but their bodies, failing and weak, were not enough to wage war against such powerful foes. It was then that the Necrontyr discovered the C'tan, great and terrible beings that lived among the stars themselves, feeding on the light of suns. The C'tan offered the Necrons a way to escape their fate, promising them immortality in exchange for their loyalty. And so, with heavy hearts but desperate for relief, the Necrons accepted. In the blink of a cosmic eye, the C'tan remade them. Gone were their frail bodies, replaced by gleaming forms of living metal. They no longer aged, no longer suffered from disease or death. They had become the Necrons, deathless and eternal. But as is often the way with such bargains, there was a price. The C'tan had not only remade their bodies, they had devoured their souls, leaving the Necrons hollow inside. The Necrons, for all their immortality, had lost what made them truly alive, and so the Necrons went to war against the Old Ones, and the galaxy trembled under the weight of their battles. Entire star systems were destroyed, their suns extinguished by the power of the C'tan and the relentless march of the Necron legions. The Old Ones, with their mastery of the warp, fought valiantly, creating new entities like the Elder and the Ox to serve as their armies, but they could not stem the tide of destruction. For many ages, the war in heaven raged on, until at last the Old Ones were driven to the brink of extinction. The Neocons and their C'tan masters stood victorious, but victory, as it so often is, was bittersweet. For even as the Old Ones were defeated, Zeke, the silent king of the Neocons, began to see the truth of their situation. The C'tan, though they had granted the Neocons immortality, cared nothing for them beyond their use as soldiers. The C'tan were beings of hunger, creatures that consumed the very light of stars, and they had used the Necrons as tools in their cosmic feast. The Necrons, for all their power, were little more than slaves to these star gods, and this Zath could not abide. For a long time, Syke pondered, for he was a ruler not known for harsh actions or words. He had led the Necrontyr into this war, had sought to free his people from their suffering, and now he saw only more chains. And so, in the quiet halls of his palace, he devised a plan, a way to free the Necrons from their terrible masters. With great care, Zeke and his most trusted Crypteks began to craft devices, tesseract labyrinths they called them, that could tap even the vast energies of the C'tan. And when the time was right, when the C'tan were at their most vulnerable, Zeke struck. In a moment that would be remembered throughout the galaxy's long and winding history, the Necrons turned on their masters. One by one, the Katana were shattered, their immense forms broken into countless shards, each one imprisoned in a tessellated labyrinth, never to feed on the light of stars again. The Necrons had won their freedom, but it came at a terrible cost. For though they had broken the chains of the C'tan, the Necrons were left adrift in a galaxy that had been ravaged by war. The Old Ones were gone, their empire in ruins, but the Necron dynasties were broken as well. Their legions, once mighty and unstoppable, were now scattered and damaged, their tomb worlds lying in disrepair. Worse still, The young ones, those created by the old ones to fight in their stead, still roamed the galaxy, and, though they were no match for the Necrons' technology, the Necrons themselves were too weakened to press their advantage. It was then that Saik made the decision that would define the fate of his people for the next aeons. The Necrons, he knew, could not continue as they were. They needed time to repair their tomb worlds, time to heal the wounds of war, and time to wait for a galaxy that was no longer in turmoil. Saik called for the Great Sleep, a period of stasis where the Necrons would retreat into their tombs, hidden beneath the surface of countless worlds. There they would sleep for millions of years, waiting in silence for the day when they would awaken once more. The tomb worlds were prepared, vast underground chambers filled with the cold, gleaming forms of the Necrons' legions. One by one, the Necrons marched into their stasis crypts, their minds and bodies locked in perfect preservation. And as the last tomb was sealed, the galaxy itself seemed to sigh, for the war had finally ended, and the Necrons were no more. But Seek, the Silent King, did not join his people in the Great Sleep. Instead, burdened by the weight of his decisions and the fate of his people, he exiled himself. He could not bear to watch over a galaxy that had fallen so far from the greatness he had once dreamed of. And so Zack wandered into the cold void of space, disappearing into the dark corners of the universe, leaving behind a galaxy that would soon forget the Necrons, even as they slumbered beneath its surface. The stars turned as they always had, and the galaxy moved on. The Necrons, hidden beneath the sands of time, slept in silence, their legions waiting patiently for the day when they would awaken once more. For though the galaxy had forgotten them, the Necrons had not forgotten the galaxy, and when the time came, they would rise again, as they always had, to reclaim what had been theirs. And so the Necrons slept across the vast expanse of the galaxy, from the cold fingers where the stars burned dim and faint, to the teeming heat where suns blazed in furious brightness. The Necrons' tombs lay still, their vast chambers, carved deep into the bones of forgotten planets, were filled with silent legions, their metal bodies locked in eternal slumber. The Necrons had entered the Great Sleep, and the galaxy, in its endless turning, moved on without them. For millions of years, the Necrons lay hidden beneath the surface of these tomb worlds, forgotten by the stars they had once sought to rule. Above them, the galaxy changed as it always did. Stars were born and died, flaring into life, only to collapse into the cold embrace of the void. Civilizations rose from the dust, built empires that stretched across the stars, and then fell, leaving only ruins behind. But the constants, timeless and unchanging, took no part in this great cycle of rise and fall. They waited, patient and still, as they always had, beneath the ground. The tombs themselves were wonders of ancient design. Great doors of black metal, sealed tight, lay hidden under the shifting sands of desert worlds, or buried beneath the ice of frozen planets. Their entrances were long forgotten, swallowed by the passing ages, until even the memory of the tombs was lost to time. Deep within, the tombs hummed faintly with the energy of machines, far older than any living being could comprehend. They had been built to last for eternity, and though the galaxy above them moved on, the tombs remained untouched, their systems maintaining a perfect stillness. Inside, the robots lay in stasis, their forms as cold and still as the metal from which they had been forged. Row upon row of silent automatons stood motionless in their chambers, their green eyes dark, their weapons held loosely in hands that had not moved in millennia. They were not dead, for the Necrons did not die. Their bodies were made of necrodemus, a living metal that could repair itself from almost any wound. And their minds, though dulled by the passage of time, were preserved in the stasis fields that kept them frozen in the moment before awakening. There was no sound in the tomb worlds, no movement, no life. It was a silence deeper than any living thing could comprehend, a silence that stretched across aeons. The young aces, those that arose during the Necrons' long slumber, would have found such stillness unnerving, for they were creatures of noise and motion, constantly striving, constantly changing. But the Necrons were different. They had long ago shed the concerns of mortality, and in their sleep, they were content to wait. Time to the Necrons was meaningless. As the Necrons slept, the galaxy above them continued its slow, relentless dance. The Elder, those proud and ancient beings shaped by the Old Ones, rose to prominence during the Necrons' long absence. The civilization, rich in art, knowledge, and psychic power, spread across the stars like a great and glittering web. The Elders were a race of dreamers, their lives measured not in decades or centuries, but in millennia. They built worlds of beauty and wonder, where every thought, every emotion was made real by their mastery of the craft. But for all their greatness, the Elders did not know of the Necrons that slept beneath their feet. To them, the tomb worlds were nothing more than distant and forgotten planets, barren and lifeless. Then came the humans, unlike the Elders, whose rise was slow and graceful. Humanity's spread across the galaxy was chaotic and furious. They were a young race, fragile and fleeting, their lives burning bright but short. Yet, for all their mortality, the humans were driven by an insatiable desire to conquer, to explore, to push the boundaries of their existence. They built ships that sailed through the warp, their colonies spreading like wildfire across the stars. The Imperium of Man was born in blood and fire, an empire that stretched across countless worlds, but one that was always teetering on the edge of collapse. Even as the humans built their empire, they remained unaware of the horrors that lay beneath the surface of the worlds. They claimed that they excavated deeply into planets rich in minerals and resources, mined the bones of ancient worlds, and constructed cities atop the very tombs of the Necrons' dynasties. Yet the Necrons remained in a state of slumber. The humans occasionally discovered ruins, peculiar structures composed of black stone or ancient metals that they were unable to identify. But these were dismissed as relics of forgotten civilizations, long deceased and of no consequence. How little they knew. For while the galaxy above them changed and shifted, the Necrons' tombs remained as they always had, silently eternal, waiting. The systems that had been set in place before the Great Sleep still functioned, their machines humming softly as they monitored the conditions of the galaxy above. They waited for the right time, for the moment when the Neocons would rise again and reclaim their place among the stars, and while that time had not yet come, the tombs were prepared. They had been built with a patience that no mortal could understand, designed to last until the end of time itself, if necessary. On some worlds, the surface changed beyond recognition. Deserts became oceans, mountains crumbled into plains, and forests grew where once there had been only rock. In these places, the tomb worlds sank deep into the ground, their entrances sealed by the weight of millennia. On other planets, where glaciers moved slowly across the landscape, the tombs were buried beneath ice and snow, hidden away in the frozen darkness. But no matter how the galaxy shifted, the tombs remained. Inside, the Necrons' overlords still stood in their grand halls, surrounded by their legions of warriors. They had once been kings and lords of the Necrons' tie, but now they were something more, something eternal. Their minds, unlike those of the lesser Necrons, were still sharp, though locked in a dreamless stasis. They remembered the days of the Necron Empire, remembered the bitter war against the Old Ones, and the terrible cost of their transformation. And though they had slept for millennia, their thoughts had not dulled. They knew that one day the time would come for them to awaken, to rise once more and claim the galaxy, and so they waited. The young aces continued their ways, the empires grew and fell, and the stars themselves shifted in their courses. But the ancients, deep beneath the surface of forgotten worlds, did not change. They were eternal, untouched by the passage of time, and they knew that, when the time came, they would rise. For now, though, they were content to wait in the cold, dark silence of their tombs, and the galaxy, oblivious to the power that lay hidden just beneath its surface, continued to turn. For millions of years, the beings slept, hidden away, beneath the surface of 1,000 forgotten worlds. Deep within their tombs, in chambers colder than the void itself, they lay in perfect stillness, their minds locked in stasis, their bodies untouched by the passage of time. But deep within the machinery of their tombs, something was beginning to change. It started slowly. At first, a flicker of light in the darkened halls, a soft hum from the ancient generators that powered their stasis fields. These were tomb worlds spread across the stars, each one the resting place of a necrodynasty, and each one governed by the intricate, mechanical workings of their vast, self-sustaining systems. The Necrons had built their tombs to last for millions of years, and they had done so well, but even the finest machines, left alone for too long, can begin to break down. On some tomb worlds, it was the passing of time itself that had taken its toll. Machinery that had once hummed with the perfect rhythm of Necron precision now sputtered and groaned under the weight of millennia. Power grids flickered, the once steady energy flows interrupted by age and wear. In some places, the tombs remained dormant, their systems still functional, but teetering on the edge of failure. In others, the machinery began to awaken, slowly stirring the Necrons within. It was not an immediate awakening. No, the Necrons had learned patience beyond measure, and their tombs reflected that. The awakening was a slow and careful process, one that stretched across centuries. The tombs were built to revive their inhabitants only when the galaxy was once again ripe for conquest. When the younger races had risen and matured enough for the Necrons to claim their place as rulers once more. But something had changed in the galaxy, something that triggered the awakening sooner than expected. In the far reaches of the galaxy, a disturbance in the warp, unseen and unfelt by the Nictons themselves, who had no connection to that psychic realm, rippled through space. The galaxy was in turmoil. The young aces, once fledgling empires, had grown strong. The Imperium of Man, vast and sprawling, now spanned the stars, its fleets and armies engaged in endless wars to defend its territories. The elderly, ancient and wise, though greatly diminished, still clung to the remnants of their once great empire. And beyond the known galaxy, dark forces gathered, hostile forms from the void, creatures of the immaterium, and threats from beyond the stars themselves. It was this turmoil, this chaos, that finally stirred the neurons from their long slumber. Slowly, across 1,000 tomb worlds, ancient mechanisms clicked into place, and the great process of awakening began. On one such world, a planet long forgotten by the galaxy, the first signs of movement came in the form of a soft rumble deep beneath the Earth. The planet itself had been silent for millennia, its surface covered in the dust of dead aeons. But beneath the ground, in the hidden depths of its tombs, the neon systems were coming to life. Vast underground chambers, each one holding an army of silent, metallic warriors, began to hum with energy. The AI, which had been still for so long, now stirred as the generators powered up, flooding the stasis fields with the energy needed to revive their occupants. Slowly, ever so slowly, the fists of the Necrons' wavers stirred. Their cold metal bodies, untouched by time, began to move. At first, it was a simple twitch, a flicker of movement in the fingers of a Necron wavers, its glowing green eyes flaring to life. Then another and another, until the entire chamber was filled with the soft sound of metal scraping against metal as the Necrons' legions awoke. These were the lower ranks of the Necrons' armies, the warriors who had once served in the front lines of the war in heaven. They were silent, obedient, their minds dulled by the long passage of time and the process of Bio-Transference that had stripped them of their souls. But their bodies were strong, and as they stood, their glowing eyes focused on the tasks they had been programmed to fulfill. Above them, in chambers more elaborate and grand, the overlords and Crypteks began to stir as well. These were the leaders of the Necron dynasties, beings of great intelligence and power, who retained more of their individuality and cunning than the mindless warriors beneath them. Among them were the overlords, rules of their tomb worlds, each one awakening with the knowledge that their time had come again. The galaxy was changing, and they would soon rise to reclaim it. But all was not well in every tomb world. While some systems awoke as planned, others had suffered during the long passage of time. On certain worlds, entire sections of the tomb complexes had collapsed, leaving vast chambers buried beneath rock and debris. In others, the stasis fields had malfunctioned, causing the neocons within to decay, their bodies no longer the perfect, shining metal of their kind. These tomb worlds awoke to chaos, their once proud legions reduced to mindless drones, broken and malfunctioning. For the Necron overlords, these malfunctions were more than a mere inconvenience. They were a challenge to their power. Each dynasty had its own goals, its own vision of the future, and the awakening of the tomb worlds brought not only the promise of conquest, but also the threat of internal strife. With the galaxy now filled with new empires, the Necrons would need to rebuild, to organize their shattered dynasties, and prepare for war once more. But first, they had to restore order to their own ranks. And so, across the galaxy, the Necrons stirred. The tomb worlds awoke, some in perfect silence, others in chaos, as the ancient legions prepared for the long-awaited rise. The galaxy, still unaware of the ancient threat that had lain beneath its surface for so long, carried on with its ways and its struggles, oblivious to the fact that the Necrons, once the greatest power in the stars, were awakening once again. It was a slow awakening, careful and deliberate, as the Necron dynasties began to rise from the ashes of their own history. Their time had come again, and though the galaxy did not yet know it, the Necrons would soon reclaim what was once theirs. Across the silent expanse of the galaxy, long dormant tomb worlds stirred to life once more. Slowly, the ancient machinery of the Necrons, having waited patiently through the eons, began to hum and flicker. The Great Sleep was ending, and the Necron dynasties, those once mighty rulers of the stars, were awakening from their deep slumber. But this was no grand and unified return, no seamless revival of a long-lost empire. For while the Necrons were eternal, their empire was not. The dynasties, fractured by time and weakened by the ravages of war in heaven, emerged not as one but as many, each with its own ambitions, its own designs on the galaxy that had changed so much in their absence. Among the dynasties, the Sotek rose quickly to prominence. At its head stood Imhotep, the Storm Lord, a figure of immense power, strategic brilliance and unyielding determination. Imhotep had been a warrior in life and in death. He had lost none of his cunning. His dynasty, the Soltek, was the most aggressive and expansionist of the Necron dynasties, and under Imhotep's command, it sought to rebuild the Necron Empire through sheer force of arms. Imhotep was a tactician without peer, his mind as sharp as it had ever been, and he viewed the galaxy as a battlefield, ripe for conquest. To Imhotep, the young aces that now inhabited the stars were little more than an inconvenience. Upstart civilizations that had taken root in the ruins of a galaxy that rightfully belonged to the Necrons. He held them in contempt, these short-lived creatures of flesh and bone, and he saw their empires as fragile things, easily shattered by the cold, calculated might of the Necron legions. With his armies of gleaming warriors, his vast flotillas of ships, and his mastery of strategy, Imhotep set about the task of reclaiming the stars. But Imhotep was not the only Necron overlord with ambitions of power. Across the galaxy, in the depths of their own tomb worlds, other dynasties were awakening, each with its own agenda, its own vision for the future of the Necron's ace. The Nyalek dynasty, ruled by the proud and arrogant overlord Pion Kazadek, was one such rival. The Nyalak considered themselves the true heirs of Nekon Ganj, devoted to the preservation of their ancient heritage. While the Sotek sought conquest, the Nyhalak believed in restoring the glory of the past through tradition and meticulous adherence to the old ways. Kazadek viewed Imhotep's brutal and direct approach with disdain. To him, the Stormlord's relentless drive for war lacked the dignity and refinement that a Necron ruler should embody. The Nikalak believed that the Necron's ace should rise, again as it had once been, with all the pomp and ceremony of its golden age. In their tomb worlds, the Nikalak preserved the ancient relics of their empire, maintaining their stasis, vaults, and archives with religious fervor. The allies, though smaller than those of the Soltek, were equipped with the finest Nekon's technology, each one gleaming with the perfection of their heritage. Between the Soltek and the Nihalak, tension simmered, though war between them had not yet broken out. The galaxy was vast, and there was room, enough for both dynasties to pursue their ambitions, for now. But beneath the surface, the Nekon's overlords knew that soon or late, their paths would collide. Both Imhotep and Khazad considered themselves the rightful leaders of the Necron dynasty, and neither was willing to bow to the other. Yet looming over all the dynasties, like a shadow cast by a long-forgotten star, was Shak the Silent King. Long ago, it had been Sayek who had led the Necrontyr into the pact with the Canton, and it was Sayek who had guided the Necron Ace into the Great Sleep, burdened by the weight of his decisions and the cost of the Bio-Transference. Sayek had exiled himself from the Necron Ace after the war in heaven, wandering the void between galaxies, consumed by guilt and regret. But now Sayek had returned, the Silent King as he was called, had watched from the shadows as his people awoke from their long slumber. He had seen the fractured state of the dynasties, the rivalries that had sprung up between them, and he knew that the Necron Ace was at a crossroads. Shak was no fool. He understood that the galaxy had changed, in ways that even he could not have foreseen. The young aces, of all their fault, had built empires that spanned the stars, and though the Necrons were more powerful than any of them, the Necrons' ace was no longer united, as it once had been. Shak's return was not without purpose. He had come back to the Necrons' ace, not to conquer, but to unite. The Silent King sought to restore the Necrons to their former glory, to gather the fractured dynasties under his banner, and forge a single unified empire that could, once again, dominate the stars. However, this was no easy task. Shak's authority, once absolute, was now questioned by the overlords who had awakened in his absence. Imhotep, in particular, viewed the Silent King's return with suspicion. The Stormlord, with all his ambitions, was not eager to bend the knee to any rule, even one as legendary as Shak. To shake the galaxy was a dangerous place, full of threats that could not be ignored. The young aces were not merely nuisances, they were a destabilizing force, creatures whose chaotic nature threatened the stability of the universe itself. Shak believed that the Necrons, as the oldest and most advanced ace, had a duty to bring order to the galaxy, to subjugate or destroy the young aces, before their reckless expansion plunged the universe into ruin. But the Silent King's return brought more than just a vision of unity. His return rekindled old rivalries and ambitions, as overlords like Imhotep and Khazad began to position themselves, not just for control of their own dynasties, but for the future of the Necrons' entire existence. Some overlords whispered that Sak's time had passed, that the Silent King, for all his wisdom, was a relic of an age long gone. Others saw his return as a chance to solidify their own power, aligning themselves with him to gain favor and position in the new Necron hierarchy. The stage was set for a new conflict, not a war of guns and gauntlets, but a war of intrigue and ambition, where dynastic rivalries would determine the future of the Necrons' ace. Imhotep sought conquest, Khazad sought to preserve the old ways, and Sayek sought unity. And all the while the galaxy remained unaware of the storm that was brewing in the shadows. The Necrons, once a single mighty empire, had become a collection of fragmented dynasties, each vying for power in their own way. But one thing was certain, the galaxy would soon know their name again. For a while, the young aces squabbled over their fleeting empires. The Necrons were eternal, and they would not be forgotten. In the far reaches of the galaxy, where stars flickered like distant candles, and planets drifted in silence, the Necron dynasties had once ruled supreme. Their empire had stretched across the stars, a vast and glittering web of power and dominion. But that was before. The days of glory had passed into shadow, and now as the Necrons stirred from their long sleep, the dynasties found themselves fragmented, scattered across the tomb worlds, where they had slumbered for millennia. Yet despite the passage of time, and the great upheavals that had shaken the galaxy, the structure of Necron society remained as rigid and unyielding as ever. The Necrons were not a race given to chaos or disorder. They had been forged from the remnants of the Necrons, a people once cursed by the fragility of their mortal forms, and, in their transformation into beings of living metal, they had adopted a hierarchy that reflected their cold, mechanical nature. At the pinnacle of this hierarchy were the Pharaons, the rulers of the great Necron dynasties. Each Pharaon was a king in their own right, governing not just their tomb world, but often vast systems of planets, each one bound to their will by ancient decrees and laws, as immutable as the stars themselves. The Phaons were the remnants of the ancient nobility, and in their metallic forms, they retained all the ambition, arrogance, and ruthlessness that had once driven them to seek dominion over the galaxy. But being a Phaon was not merely a matter of status, it was a burden of eternal responsibility. The Phaons were charged with maintaining the stability and strength of their dynasties, ensuring that their legions of Necron warriors remained loyal and ready for the day when they would be called upon to rise again. These rulers had spent the long centuries of the Geat, sleeping in stasis, but their minds had never truly rested. Even in slumber, they had calculated and planned, dreaming of the day when their dynasties would, once again, march across the stars. Beneath the pharaohs were the overlords, lesser kings who ruled individual tomb worlds or small sectors of the Necron Empire. While the pharaohs commanded entire systems, the overlords governed the day-to-day operations of their tombs, ensuring that the machinery of resurrection and stasis continued to function as intended. The overlords were ambitious and powerful, each one seeking to expand their influence within the confines of the Necron society. But they were bound by an unshakable loyalty to their pharaoh. Necron society, after all, valued order above all else, and even the most ambitious overlord knew that rebellion against the ancient hierarchy was unthinkable. The Lich Guard, the elite warriors of the Necron dynasties, stood as protectors of the pharaohs and overlords. In life, these were the most skilled and trusted of the Necrons, warriors, and in death, they had been transformed into powerful, immortal guardians. Their purpose was singular: to protect the rulers of their dynasties at any cost. Equipped with shields and wavy scythes, the Lich Guards were more than just bodyguards. They were living symbols of the Necrons' authority, their presence a reminder of the absolute power of the Pyrons. But the true strength of the Necron dynasties lay not in the hands of their rulers or their elite warriors, but in the vast legions of Necron warriors that filled the tombs. These were the foot soldiers of the Necron's ace, mindless automatons stripped of all individuality, their thoughts and memories erased in the process of Bio-Transference. The Necrons' minds marched in perfect unison, their Gauss rifles gleaming in the darkness, ready to reduce any enemy they encountered to atoms. Though they lacked the intelligence or autonomy of the higher ranks, their sheer numbers made them a force to be reckoned with. Above all these ways, the Necrons' rules commanded the loyalty of the Crypteks, the Technomystics, who maintained the complex technologies that sustained Necron's society. The Crypteks were among the most powerful and enigmatic figures in the Necrons' hierarchy, for it was they who controlled the resurrection protocols that allowed fallen Necrons to rise again, their bodies repairing themselves from even the most grievous wounds. The Crypteks were not only scientists, but also engineers of reality itself, capable of manipulating time, matter, and energy with their arcane devices. They were masters of the technologies that made the Necrons immortal, and as such, they held a unique place within the dynasties. The Crypteks' knowledge was vast, and their mastery of technology unparalleled, but their loyalty was always in question. Many Crypteks were known for their independence, their desire to pursue their own experiments and ambitions, and while they served the pharaohs and overlords, they often did so with a degree of arrogance. They were not soldiers, they were the architects of Necron's immortality, and they knew that without them, even the greatest pharaoh could fall. Though Necron's society was rigid and hierarchical, it was not without its rivals, the dynasties, while united by their shared history and purpose, often found themselves in conflict with one another. Imhotep, the Stomlord ruler of the Sotek dynasty, sought to expand his power through conquest, viewing the fragmented state of the Necrons' empire as an opportunity to claim dominance over the other dynasties. His strategies were flawless, his armies disciplined and vast, and under his command, the Sotek dynasty had become one of the most powerful forces among the Necrons. But not all pharaohs shared Imhotep's thirst for war. In the Nilak dynasty, Overlord Khazadek ruled with a different vision. He believed that the Necrons' strength lay in their heritage, in the careful preservation of their ancient culture and technology. While Imhotep sought to conquer, Khazad-dût focused on preserving the old ways, ensuring that the Nihilak tombs remained pristine and their knowledge untouched by the ravages of time. To Khazad-dût, the young aces that now populated the galaxy were mere distractions, unworthy of the Necrons' attention. He believed that in time, the young aces would destroy themselves, and the Necrons would rise to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, without the need for bloody conquest. Yet, above even the factions, in the distant and silent darkness, there was Soek, the Silent King. Though he had once led the Necrons into the pact with the Citan, and had guided them through the war in heaven, Soek had long since exiled himself from the Necrons' ace, burdened by the guilt of what he had done. But Zaek had awaited, watching from the shadows as the dynasties awakened, fragmented and leaderless. He knew that the Necrons could not rise again without unity, without a single purpose. The Silent King sought to reunite the dynasties, to restore the empire to its former glory. But Shark was not the only one with ambitions, and the dynasties, with their powerful overlords and pharaohs, were not so easily led. Thus, the Necron dynasties stood rigid in their structure, yet filled with ambition and rivalry. Their rulers, though immortal, were far from immune to the lust for power, and as they awoke from their long slumber, the stage was set for a new era of conflict and conquest. The galaxy, unaware of the storm that was brewing, would soon come to know the Necrons once more, and the dynasties, with all their ancient strength and ambition, would reclaim their place among the stars. In the labyrinthine depths of Necron tombs, where the air was still and cold, and the light from 1,000 forgotten stars could never reach, there lay a secret, far more valuable than the towering legions of warriors or the shining monoliths of war. This secret was neither a weapon nor a fortress, but something far greater, something that made the Necrons more than conquerors, more than mere machines. It was the gift of immortality itself, a power that set them apart from every other ace that dared to tame the stars. And this power lay in the hands of the Crypteks. The Crypteks were the technomancers of the Necrons' age, the keepers of ancient and arcane sciences, whose understanding of the universe reached far beyond even the most advanced minds of the younger aces. In the days of the Necron, the Crypteks had been the greatest scientists, engineers, and artisans of their kind, bending the laws of reality to their will. Now, as Necrons, they wielded even greater power, for their minds, free from the frailties of flesh, had transcended mortality, along with their fellow Necrons. But while others had been bound to the duties of war and leadership, the Crypteks had continued to pursue their studies, delving ever deeper into the mysteries of the cosmos. At the heart of the Cryptek power lay the Resurrection Protocols, a set of ancient and highly guarded technologies that allowed the Necrons to rise again and again, no matter how many times they were struck down in battle. It was the Crypteks who maintained and controlled these protocols, ensuring that the legions of the Necrons' armies could always be brought back from the brink of destruction. To the Crypteks, death was not an end, it was merely a delay. Resurrection protocols were the very lifeblood of the Necrons' dynasties. On the battlefield, when a Necron warrior was struck down, their body made of necrodermis, the living metal that could heal itself, would begin to reassemble. Bones of gleaming silver would knit themselves together, and shattered limbs would reform, ready to fight again. But it was the resurrection protocols, overseen by the Crypteks, that ensured this process continued on a grand scale, reviving entire armies with chilling efficiency. The execution protocols were more than simple mechanics or healing techniques. They were a reflection of the Crypteks' mastery over life and death. With their knowledge of quantum entanglement, matter manipulation, and the hidden forces of the universe, the Crypteks had perfected the art of execution. To the Crypteks, this was not magic, though to the younger ones it might as well have been. It was science so advanced, so intricate that it bordered on the supernatural. Though the resurrection protocols, the Crypteks held the key to the Necrons' greatest strength, the ability to endure, to outlast, to return time and time again. But the Crypteks were not merely caretakers of the Necrons' armies, they were far more than that. In the great dynasties of the Necrons, the Crypteks held a position of immense influence. They were not warriors, nor were they rulers like the pharaohs and overlords, but their knowledge made them indispensable to the survival of the Necrons' ace. Without the Crypteks, the resurrection protocols would fail, and the Necrons' armies would be reduced to little more than broken machines, unable to rise from the dead, their immortality shattered. This power gave the Crypteks a unique status within Necron society. No Phaon, no matter how powerful, could afford to alienate the Crypteks. The Crypteks knew this, and though they served the dynasties, they did so with an air of superiority. They were not bound by the rigid hierarchies that governed the conventional military. Instead, they operated on the fringes of power, their independence protected by the sheer necessity of their work. Crypteks were often eccentric, their minds focused on the pursuit of knowledge, rather than the mundane concerns of leadership or battle. Some Crypteks would disappear for centuries, lost in their experiments, only to emerge with new inventions or improvements to the execution protocols. But for all their independence, the Crypteks were not immune to the rivalries that defined Necron society. Among their ranks, there were those who sought to perfect the execution protocols further, to push the limits of what was possible. Anarchia, a Cryptek of immense renown, was one such figure. He had wandered the stars, visiting tomb worlds long forgotten, seeking out new technologies to improve the execution protocols, to unlock the future of the Necron race, which depended not just on their ability to rise again, but on their ability to evolve. He believed that the resurrection protocols, though powerful, were not infallible, and he sought to make them even more reliable, more efficient, so that the Necrons could reclaim their rightful place in the galaxy without fear of permanent loss. But not all Crypteks shared Anarchia's vision. Some, like Oikun the Divine, were more concerned with the manipulation of time itself. Oikun had long studied the threads of fate, using his knowledge of chronomancy to predict and influence the future. To him, the resurrection protocols were merely a tool, a means to an end in his quest to control the flow of time. Oikun believed that with enough mastery over time, the need for resurrection would be obsolete. He saw the future of the Necrons not in constant rebirth, but in perfecting the moment, ensuring that no Necron would fall in the first place. These differing visions among the cryptids created an undercurrent of tension within Necron society. Each cryptid had their own agenda, their own view of what the future should hold for their people. While they all maintained the resurrection protocols, ensuring the Necron legions could rise again and again, their true ambitions often lay in realms far beyond the battlefield. For the Crypteks, immortality was not enough. They sought to perfect it, to reshape the very fabric of reality to their will. Some experimented with translocation technology, developing ways to instantly transport entire Necron armies across vast distances, ensuring that their legions could strike anywhere, at any time. Others delved into the mysteries of quantum shielding, creating bases of energy that could protect Neon forces from even the most devastating weapons. Each Cryptek sought to leave their mark on the Neons, as their experiments and inventions shaped the future of their people in ways that even the Phantoms could not always foresee. And so the Crypteks worked in the shadows, their minds ever tuning their experiments, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The resurrection protocols, though ancient, were constantly being refined, improved upon by the Crypteks, who saw in them not just a tool of conflict, but a symbol of the necromancer's mastery over death itself. It was through the resurrection protocols that the necromancers remained eternal, their legions marching forth from their tombs, unbroken and unyielding, no matter how many times they fell in battle. The young aces of the galaxy, with their fragile lives and fleeting empires, could not understand the true nature of the Necrons. To them, the Necrons' legions were an unstoppable force, a tide of living metal that could never be fully defeated. They did not know that, behind the shining arms of warriors stood the crypts, their minds cold and calculating, always working to ensure that the Necrons' race would endure for all eternity. In the cold and silent depths of their tomb worlds, The Necrons had not only preserved themselves, though the endless march of time, but had also safeguarded the terrible weapons that had once made them the most feared empire in the galaxy. While other races crafted weapons of steel and fire, weapons that blazed and shone for but a moment, the Necrons wielded instruments of war that operated on principles far more ancient and far more devastating, machines that could unravel the very essence of matter itself. To the Necrons, war was a science, not an art. Their weapons did not simply kill, they annihilated, reduced, and unmade. Among the vast amounts of the Necrons' dynasties, none was more feared than the Gauss Flay, the standard weapon of their legions. Though it appeared to the untrained eye as a sleek and simple rifle, its power lay not in brute force, but in the terrifying science that drove it. Gauss weapons function by stripping the very molecules of a target apart, layer by layer, atom by atom, until nothing remained but dust. Whether it was a tank of the Empire or the flesh of a monstrous creature, the Gauss Flayer showed no preference. It reduced all things to their most basic components, with the same cold efficiency. The Gauss Flayer was but one of the many tools that the aggressors had devised in their relentless pursuit of destruction. The more advanced Gauss cannons, mounted on the swift skimmers known as annihilation barges or in the hands of their elite immortals, could bring down entire fortifications with ease. The deadly beams disintegrated anything in their path, the very ground scorched and broken beneath their touch. It was as if the universe itself recoiled from the unnatural forces wielded by the beings. But the arsenal was not limited to the Gauss weaponry, for from it, the ancient technology that the society wielded had unlocked knowledge that bordered on the arcane. There was the Tesla cannon, named for its eerie cackling discharge of energy that leapt from target to target in arcing bolts of lightning. Unlike conventional weaponry, which destroys in a methodical, clinical manner, the Tesla cannon tore through enemy ranks with chaotic bursts of energy, leaping from one unfortunate victim to another in a violent display of electrical fury. Even armored vehicles, designed to resist the harshest of physical weapons, found their circuitry fried and their systems crippled by the relentless onslaught of neon-like lightning. Then there were the more arcane and terrifying devices, such as the particle whips and death rays. These were not the crude, explosive weapons of the younger ages, but instead, weapons that tore at the very fabric of reality itself. The particle whip, often mounted on the towing doomsday apparatus, projected a concentrated stream of particles at such velocity that entire armies could be vaporized in seconds. What made the particle whip especially fearsome was the eerie silence with which it killed. One moment a target might stand defiant, the next there would be nothing left but a charred imprint on the battlefield, as though reality itself had quietly excised their existence. And then there was the death ray, a beam of concentrated energy, so powerful that it could slice through starships and planets alike. Mounted on the formidable Doomside, the death ray was a precision weapon of unparalleled lethality. While other aces might fire volleys of torpedoes or plasma, hoping to overwhelm their targets through brute force, the Necron's death ray needed only a single sweep to cut through even the thickest armor. It was the surgical precision of the Necrons, a machine at its finest, cutting away the excess until only the desired result remained: utter destruction. However, no discussion of their weaponry would be complete without mention of their most iconic and fearsome war machine, the Monolith. To many, the Monolith appeared more like a monument than a weapon, a vast, floating pyramid of black stone and shimmering green light. But this monument was anything but passive. The Monolith was both a fortress and a weapon, its facades armed with plasma flux arcs and particle whips that could rain destruction on any enemy that dared stand before it. Worse still, the Monolith could act as a portal for the Necrons, legions teleporting reinforcements directly into the heat of battle. From the Monolith's darkened portals, endless ranks of Necrons, wraiths, and immortals would emerge, unfeeling and unstoppable, marching forth to claim the battlefield. The true power of the Monolith, however, lay not in its weaponry, but in its resilience. Made of living metal, it could repair itself from almost any damage, regenerating from even the most devastating attacks. While the tanks and war machines of the young aces might burn and crumble under fire, the monolith could reform, its surface flowing like liquid as it rebuilt itself in the midst of battle. There was no safe place to strike a monolith, no weak point to exploit. It was a symbol of the Neocon's eternal nature, unyielding and unbreakable. And still there are weapons to be found among the Necon's arsenal. The Necrons possess technology, capable of destroying entire star systems. The World Engine, a massive planet-sized war machine, had the power to annihilate entire worlds with its devastating weaponry. The mere existence of such a device spoke to the unfathomable scale of Necon's ambition. Where other races sought to control planets or sectors, the Necrons looked beyond to the very stars themselves. The Tesseract vaults, housing fragments of the shattered Catan, were another reminder of the Necrons, testifying mastery over the cosmos. These Catan shards, once godlike beings, had been imprisoned within these immense structures, their vast powers harnessed as weapons by their former slaves. A Tesseract vault unleashed the awe-inspiring primal energy of a star god on the battlefield, obliterating anything in its path with a mere thought, a simple gesture. To witness the Catan in battle was to witness the power of the cosmos itself, bound and controlled, but no less dangerous for it. And of course, there were the Canoptek constructs, the Necrons' silent, tireless servants of war. The Canoptek scarabs, tiny machines that scuttled across the battlefield, could devour tanks and fortifications with relentless speed, reducing metal and flesh alike to little more than dust. The Canoptek warriors, with their ability to phase through solid matter, struck fear into the hearts of their enemies, appearing from nowhere to slice through defenses with their razor-sharp claws. The weapons of the Necrons were not born of fear or desperation, nor were they wielded with the crudeness, savagery of the Orcs, or the burning fanaticism of the Imperium. They were instruments of precise destruction, crafted with cold logic and deployed with an unfeeling purpose. The Necrons did not fight for glory or honor, but for dominance, for the reclamation of what they had once lost. And with their weapons in hand, they would tear down the statues themselves to achieve their goal. Far away, in the hidden cones of the galaxy, where the stars hung like dim lanterns, in the endless dark, the Necrons had mastered a secret that no other ace could claim. They could travel faster than the light itself. But this was no mere trick of speed, no simple leap through the stars, as the young aces understood it. The Necrons had long since unlocked the mysteries of time and space, and at the heart of their mastery lay the Dolmen Gates, vast enigmatic devices that allowed the Necrons to move from one point in the galaxy to another with the ease of stepping through a door. The galaxy is a vast place, filled with innumerable worlds and uncharted expanses of space. To the young aces, who had only just begun to explore the stars, travel between these worlds was fraught with danger. The Imperium of Man, with all its might, relied on the warp, a dark and unpredictable realm that lurked beneath reality, where ships could move faster than light. By plunging into a dimension of madness and chaos, the Eldar, those ancient and graceful beings, used the webway, a series of hidden tunnels between dimensions, to travel swiftly from world to world. But the Necrons had no need for such treacherous or uncertain paths, long before the Imperium had ever dreamed of venturing beyond Terra. And even before the Eldar had woven their webway, the Necrons had built the Dolmen Gates. These mysterious constructs did not rely on the web or any other dark realm. Instead, they were tied to the very fabric of the universe itself. Though the Dolmen Gates, the beings could pierce the veil of time and space, allowing them to step from one corner of the galaxy to another in the blink of an eye. To the Necrons, distance was an illusion, and with the power of the Dolmen Gates, they could span the stars with a mere thought. Each Dolmen Gate was a marvel of Necrons engineering, massive stone-like structures that seemed ancient even when they were new. To the untrained eye, they appeared as silent monuments, their surfaces etched with strange and alien runes, their purpose a mystery. But when activated, the Dolmen Gates became shimmering portals, their surfaces rippling like the surface of a calm pond, disturbed by a single drop of water. Though these gates, entire Legion armies could pass, moving across the galaxy, without ever needing to enter the warp, without ever needing to fear the dangers of the void. For the Necrons, there were no unknowns, no uncertainties. The Dolmen Gates were precise, calculated, and controlled. But the Dolmen Gates were more than just a means of travel. They were a symbol of the Necrons' mastery over the cosmos. While the young aces built crude ships that sputtered through space, the Necrons glided effortlessly from world to world. They needed no great fleets, no massive warships with the Dolmen Gates. They could appear anywhere at any time, their legions stepping through the veil of space to strike where they were least expected. And when the battle was done, they could vanish just as swiftly, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Yet the Dolmen Gates were not without their mysteries. Even among the Necrons, their workings were understood by few. It was said that the Dolmen Gates were tied to the Blackstone fortresses, ancient and indestructible, relics from the time of the war in heaven. These fortresses scattered across the galaxy were linked to the Dolmen Gates, allowing the Necrons to use their power to bypass the warp altogether. Though the Blackstone fortresses, the Necrons, could manipulate the flow of energy between the stars, warping time and space to their will. It was a secret that only the highest-ranking Crypteks truly understood, and even they spoke of it in whispers. For the technology was so advanced, so far beyond even their understanding, that it bordered on the realm of the divine. But despite the power of the Dolmen Gates, there was an even greater mystery surrounding them. Though they had once been the Necrons' greatest asset, there were some who whispered that the gates had grown unstable over the millennia. Time had passed, the galaxy had shifted, and even the Necrons, with all their power, could not stop the slow decay of the universe. Some tomb worlds had lost their connection to the gates, their portals now silent and dormant, while others had become unpredictable, opening not to the stars but to strange, forgotten places. For Imhotep the Great Lord, master of the sacred dynasty, the Dolmen Gates were an invaluable tool. With them, he could send his forces across vast distances, in an instant striking at the heart of his enemies, before they even knew he had arrived. Imhotep understood the power of the gates, and he used them with the precision of a master tactician. When the young aces tried to predict his movements, they found themselves confounded. One moment, Imhotep's legions would be on one side of the galaxy, and the next they would be on another, appearing as if from nowhere to overwhelm their foes. The Stormlord used the Dolmen Gates as a weapon, in themselves a means of control over the battlefield, that no other ace could hope to match. Yet, not all Necron overlords shared Imhotep's confidence. There were those who distrusted the Dolmen Gates, who believed that their use was becoming too dangerous, too unpredictable. Some whispered of tomb worlds that had been lost, their legions stepping through the gates only to vanish, never to be seen again. Others spoke of dark forces, lurking at the edges of reality, waiting for the moment when the Guardians would overlap, when their control over the gates would fail. And still there were others, such as the one called the Divine, master of chronomancy, who believed that the Dolmen Gates were not merely tools of travel, but keys to something far greater, something tied to the very structure of the galaxy itself. But even with these doubts, the Dolmen Gates remained a cornerstone of knowledge, power. They allowed the Necrons to remain elusive, even moving appearing where they were least expected. They were not bound by the slow crawl of time or the dangers of the warp, but instead they traveled on their own terms with the cold precision of an ace that had long since conquered the stars. To the young aces, the Dolmen Gates were a token, a sign that the Necrons could be anywhere at any time, watching from the shadows, ready to strike without warning. In a galaxy filled with danger, uncertainty, and war, the Necrons stood apart with the Dolmen Gates. They held a power that no other ace could match. They had transcended the need for ships, for fleets, for the cumbersome trappings of interstellar travel. For the Necrons, the stars themselves were but stepping stones in their endless march toward dominion. And while the younger ones struggled to navigate the treacherous pathways of the warp, the Necrons moved silently and swiftly, passing through the Dolmen Gates as easily as a traveler stepping through the door of their own home. And so, as the galaxy aged and waned, the Necrons remained a mystery, their motives and movements known only to themselves. The Dolmen Gates flickered to life in the dark places of the universe, their green light casting long shadows over forgotten worlds. And wherever those shadows fell, the Necrons were sure to follow. Far away in the quiet corners of the galaxy, where the stars flickered faintly, in the cold and empty darkness, a king once thought lost was sitting. His name, though, spoken in whispers by the few who still remembered, had long been absent from the tumult of the younger ages. Shark knew that if the factions could be united, if the dynasties could be brought together once more under a single banner, they could reclaim their place as rulers of the galaxy. But the Silent King also knew that unity would not come easily. The dynasties led by ambitious overlords and pharaohs were not inclined to follow the commands of any ruler, even one as legendary as Shark. They had awoken in a galaxy filled with opportunity, and each dynasty sought to carve out its own empire, to reclaim its own piece of glory. Many of the overlords, such as Imhotep the Stormlord, had no desire to bow to Shark's authority. Imhotep, with his vast armies and brilliant strategies, saw himself as the rightful leader of the Necrons' ace, and he was not alone in this ambition. Zayak, however, had anticipated this. He was no stranger to the rivalries and ambitions of the Necrons' nobility. He knew that to unite the dynasties, he would need more than just the weight of his name, or the legend of his deeds. He would need to show the Necrons' lords that unity was the only path to victory. He would need to remind them of the great and terrible purpose that had once driven their ace. And so the Silent King began his slow and careful return to power. He did not command as he might have in the days of old. Instead, he sought out the dynasties one by one, meeting with their rulers, speaking to them, not as a king, but as a person, an equal. He offered them not domination, but partnership. He promised them that under his guidance, the Necrons' ace could rise again, not as a fragmented collection of squabbling dynasties, but as a single unified empire, greater than it had ever been before. Some of the overlords, particularly those whose tombs, worlds had suffered from the ravages of time, were quick to join Zayak. They saw in him the wisdom of ages, the calm certainty of a leader who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer and had survived. Others were more reluctant, wary of Shak's return, suspicious of his motives, but even they could not deny the power and presence of the Silent King. He was a figure out of legend, a ruler who had once led them through the greatest conflict in history, and his return had rekindled something long dormant within the Necrons' ace. But these wee others still, overlords like Imhotep, who saw Zayak's return as a threat, they had their own ambitions, their own plans for the future of the Necrons' race. They represented the past, a relic of an era that had long since faded. These overlords would not bow to the Silent King without a fight, and Zayak knew that if he were to unite the Necrons, he would need to overcome their resistance. And so, the Silent King moved like a shadow through the galaxy, gathering allies, forging alliances, and laying the groundwork for the Necrons' resurgence. While other aces might fire volleys of torpedoes or plasma, hoping to overwhelm their targets through brute force, the Necrons' death ray needed only a single sweep to cut through even the thickest armor. It was the surgical precision of the Necrons, a machine at its finest, cutting away the excess until only the desired result remained, utter destruction. However, no discussion of their weaponry would be complete without mention of their most iconic and fearsome war machine, the Monolith. To many, the Monolith appeared more like a monument than a weapon, a vast, floating pyramid of black stone and shimmering green light. But this monument was anything but passive. The Monolith was both a fortress and a weapon, its facades armed with plasma flux arcs and particle whips that could rain destruction on any enemy that dared stand before it. Worse still, the Monolith could act as a portal for the Necrons, legions teleporting reinforcements directly into the heat of battle. From the Monolith's darkened portals, endless ranks of Necrons, wraiths, and immortals would emerge, unfeeling and unstoppable, marching forth to claim the battlefield. The true power of the monolith, however, lay not in its weaponry but in its resilience. Made of living metal, it could repair itself from almost any damage, regenerating from even the most devastating attacks. While the tanks and war machines of the young aces might burn and crumble under fire, the monolith could reform, its surface flowing like liquid as it rebuilt itself. In the midst of battle, there was no safe place to strike a monolith, no weak point to exploit. It was a symbol of the neocons' eternal nature, unyielding and unbreakable. And still there are weapons to be found among the Necrons' arsenal. The Necrons possessed technology capable of destroying entire star systems. The World Engine, a massive planet-sized war machine, had the power to annihilate entire worlds with its devastating weaponry. The mere existence of such a device spoke to the unfathomable scale of Necrons' ambition. Where other races sought to control planets or sectors, the Necrons looked beyond to the very stars themselves. The Tesseract vaults, housing fragments of the shattered Catan, were another reminder of the Necrons, testifying mastery over the cosmos. These Catan shards, once godlike beings, had been imprisoned within these immense structures, their vast powers harnessed as weapons by their former slaves. A Tesseract vault unleashed the awe-inspiring primal energy of a star god on the battlefield, obliterating anything in its path with a mere thought, a simple gesture. To witness the Catan in battle was to witness the power of the cosmos itself, bound and controlled, but no less dangerous for it. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but JH was nothing if not patient. He had wandered the void for millennia, waiting for the right moment to return. And now, as the galaxy teetered on the edge of chaos, that moment had come. Zake the Silent King had emerged, and with him came the hope of a new future for the Necrons' face, one that would see them rise once more to rule the stars. The galaxy, once vast and empty, had grown crowded while the Necrons had slept, hidden away beneath the sands of their tomb worlds. The young aces had busied themselves, building empires, waging wars, and shaping the stars in their own image. But now the Necrons had awoken, and they found that the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. Where once they had ruled uncontested, now the stars were filled with life. The Imperium of Man, a sprawling, lumbering empire that stretched across thousands of worlds, dominated much of the galaxy. The Eldar, though their empire was a shadow of what it had once been, still clung to their place among the stars, their ships darting like phantoms between worlds. And from the dark reaches of the void came the Tyranids, a terrifying, mindless swarm that consumed all in their path. To the Necrons, these young aces were little more than newcomers, squabbling over the remnants of a galaxy that had once belonged to them. They had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations before, and they knew that these newcomers, with their fragile bodies and fleeting lives, could never hope to match the power of the Necrons' dynasties. Yet the Necrons, we were not so arrogant as to ignore the threat posed by these young aces. The galaxy was a different place now, and if the Necrons were to reclaim their rightful place as its rulers, they would need to deal with these upstarts. Among the young aces, none were as vast or as tenacious as the Empire of Man. The Empire, with its billions of citizens and its countless fleets, had spread across the stars like a great tide, consuming entire sectors in its relentless march. Yet for all its power, the Empire was a brittle thing, constantly teetering on the edge of collapse. Its armies were spread thin, its worlds beset by enemies from within and without, and its leaders, while grand in title, were far from unified in vision. The Empire was a creature of desperation, always fighting to survive, and to the non-conservatives, it was this very desperation that made them both dangerous and pitiable. The Necrons did not fear the Imperium, but they expected its persistence. For all the Imperium's weaknesses, it had endured where many other empires had crumbled. The Necrons, with their cold logic, saw the Imperium not as a worthy foe, but as a temporary obstacle, one that would eventually break under its own weight. Yet, in the meantime, the Imperium posed a threat, not because of its strength, but because of its unpredictability. The humans, for all their flaws, were a stubborn force, and their willingness to throw entire armies into the midst of battle made them difficult to sweep aside. But if the Imperium was an obstacle to be dealt with, the Eldar were something more, a bitter reminder of a war long past, and a hatred that had never truly died. The Eldar, once the favored children of the Old Ones, had fought alongside their kin during the war in heaven, standing against the Necrons and their Khartan masters. Though that war had ended long ago, its scars had never healed. The Necrons had not forgotten the role the Elder had played, nor had they forgiven them. To the Necrons, the Elder were not just enemies, they were rivals, ancient and proud, whose arrogance had always grated against the cold, logical nature of the Necrons' approach. The Elder of the past had not forgotten the Necrons either, though their own empire had fallen into ruin long before the Necrons had awoken. The Elder still whispered of the terrible power that lay hidden beneath the tomb worlds. To the Elder, the Necrons were a threat, not just because of their strength, but because of their persistence. The Elder, with their long lives and fragile souls, knew that they could not hope to outlast the Necrons. Where the Elder fought with speed and grace, the Necrons moved with slow, inevitable purpose like a tide that could not be turned. The rivalry between the Necrons and the Elder was as old as the stars, and it showed no signs of fading. For every Necron tomb world that awoke, there was an Eldar craft world that sent its scouts to watch, to warn, and sometimes to strike. The Eldar, though diminished, were still a force to be reckoned with, and their ability to slip through the webway, unseen and unheard, made them a constant thorn in the side of the Necron dynasties. But the Necrons did not fear the Eldar. If anything, they relished the opportunity to settle old scores. To the Necron overlords, the Eldar represented the last vestige of the Old Ones. Arrogance, and with every Eldar world burned, they saw a small measure of vengeance for the war, long ago. Yet, as bitter as the Necrons' rivalry with the Eldar was, it was not the greatest threat they faced. That honor belonged to a new foe, one that had come from beyond the galaxy itself, the Tyranids. The Tyranids were unlike any enemy the Necrons had ever encountered. They were not driven by ambition, nor by hatred, nor by any of the emotions that motivated the other races. The Tyranids had no agenda, no plan. They existed only to consume. Entire worlds fell before the Tyranid swarms, their populations devoured, their ecosystems stripped bare, leaving nothing but lifeless husks in their wake. The Tyranids did not conquer, they did not negotiate, and they did not relent. They were a force of nature, mindless and unstoppable. To the Necrons, the Tyranids posed a unique challenge. Their sheer numbers and the relentless hunger that drove them made them difficult to fight. Unlike the Imperium, which could be outmaneuvered on the field, whose pride could be exploited, the Tyranids cared for nothing but feeding. And worse still, the Tyranids could not be killed in the same way as other enemies. For every swarm that was destroyed, another appeared, larger and more ravenous than the last. Even the Necron legions, with their advanced technology and mastery over death, found themselves hard-pressed to hold back the Tyranid onslaught. The resurrection protocols, so effective against the forces of other foes, were of little use when the Tyranids swarmed in. Such numbers that even the Necrons, who could reform quickly, could not do so swiftly enough. The Crypteks, even resourceful, had devised new strategies to counter the Tyranids, using their mastery over matter and energy to create quantum shields and force fields that could repel the swarm. But even these measures were temporary at best. The Tyranids were a foe that could not be reasoned with, a mindless tide that threatened not just the Necrons, but all life in the galaxy. And, while the Necrons viewed the other races with disdain, seeing them as obstacles to be overcome, the Tyranids were something else entirely. They were not an obstacle, they were an existential threat, one that even the Neocons could not ignore. In this changing galaxy, the Neocons found themselves at a crossroads. The Imperium, the Elder, and the Tyranids each presented different challenges, different threats to the Necron dynasties. But the Necrons were nothing if not patient. They had waited for millions of years, and they would wait again if they had to. They were eternal after all, and while the younger aces fought, and struggled for survival, the Necrons knew that time was on their side. For now, the Necrons' dynasties watched and waited, their cold eyes fixed on the galaxy that had grown so unfamiliar during their long sleep. But they were not idle. The Necrons were preparing to reclaim what had once been theirs, to sweep aside the Imperium, to settle old scores with the Eldar, and to face the terrible threat of the Tyranids. The galaxy had changed, but the Necrons, with their unyielding patience and cold logic, were ready to change it once more. In the vast cold darkness of the galaxy, where the light of ancient stars barely reached, and silence hung like a shroud, the Necrons' empire, once so mighty and unchallenged, lay in ruins. The Necrons, those ancient and immortal lords of the stars, had long ago ruled the galaxy with an iron grip, their legions marching in perfect unison, their power unmatched by any force before or since. But those days were long past, now distant memories, buried beneath the sands of forgotten tomb worlds. The Necrons' empire was not what it had been. It was fractured, broken into 1,000 pieces, each dynasty struggling to reclaim its lost glory. Once the Necrons had been united, their dynasties ruled by kings, who commanded the stars themselves. But now, after a long sleep, they had awakened to a galaxy that had changed beyond recognition. The stars, once these, were now filled with the young aces, creatures of flesh and bone, who squabbled over the ruins of the galaxy, like scavengers. And the Necrons, who had once ruled them, all were scattered, fragmented into countless dynasties, each fighting to reclaim a piece of their lost empire. The dynasties, once bound by the iron will of the Silent King, now found themselves at odds with one another. Some sought to rebuild their power through conquest, their legions marching once more to war. Others were more cautious, bided their time, seeking to preserve the ancient knowledge of their people and restore the grandeur of their tomb worlds. But in the end, they were all fighting for the same thing: control. Control of the galaxy, control of their future, and control of their own fates. Yet, despite their common goal, the Necrons were not united. They fought amongst themselves, each dynasty seeking to outdo the others, each overlord and pharaoh, believing that their vision of the future was the one that would see the Necrons ascend to its rightful place. They were like stars in the night sky, each burning brightly, but each isolated from the others, their light unable to reach across the vastness of the void. In the midst of this fragmented empire, there was one figure who stood apart. Zake, the Silent King, had emerged. The Silent King stood in the heat of his tomb world, deep within the cold, silent halls of his palace, surrounded by the endless ranks of his warriors, their gleaming metal bodies motionless in the still air. His eyes glowing with the green light of necromancy, surveyed the galaxy before him, and he felt the weight of his decisions heavy upon him. He had made choices, terrible choices long ago, choices that had saved his people, but had also doomed them. He had sought to give them immortality, and in doing so he had taken their souls. He had led them to war, and in doing so, he had brought about the near destruction of their empire. And now, as he stood upon the precipice of the future, he wondered if he had been right. The galaxy was vast, and the beings were eternal, but even eternity had its burdens, and Zake felt them more keenly than most. He had wandered the void for millennia, seeking a way to undo what had been done, to restore his people to what they had once been. But there was no going back. The Necrons could never return to their former selves. They were beings of living metal, their souls lost to the stars, their fate sealed. Yet for all his doubts, Zake remained determined. He had not returned from exile to watch his people fade into obscurity. He had come back to lead them once more, to unite the fractured dynasties, to rebuild the empire that had once ruled the stars. He knew that it would not be easy. The overlords were proud, their ambitions great. Each believed that they were the rightful heirs to the throne, and none would bow easily to another. But Zake was patient. He had waited for millennia, and he could wait a little longer. He knew that the future of the Necrons, Ace, depended on unity. If they were to reclaim the galaxy, they would need to stand together, as they had in the days of old. And Zake, for all his burdens, was determined to see that happen. As he stood in the silent darkness of his palace, Zeke contemplated the future. The galaxy had changed, but the Necrons had not. They were still the rulers of the stars, still the lords of eternity. The young aces of all their ambition, we but fleeting shadows, compared to the endless span of Necron's time. Shaq knew that the galaxy, for all its turmoil, would one day be theirs again. But the path to that future was uncertain. The dynasties were factored, the young aces strong. The Silent King knew that it would take more than power to reclaim the galaxy. It would take wisdom, patience, and the will to endure. And Zeke, with the weight of millennia upon him, had all these things. The Necrons would rise again. The Silent King would see to it. But as Zeke looked out upon the galaxy, he knew that the future of his people was not guaranteed. The stars were quiet, but the silence could not last forever. The Necrons, for all their power, were not alone in the galaxy. And as Zeke contemplated the fate of his empire, he knew that the battles to come would not be easy. But he was determined, as he always had been, to lead his people through them. The galaxy was vast, but the Necrons were eternal, and Zak, the Silent King, would see them rise once more. In the quiet darkness of the galaxy, where the stars drifted in their ancient patterns, and the young races fought their fleeting wars, the Necrons waited. Their tombs, hidden beneath the sands of forgotten worlds, or buried deep beneath the ice of planets long devoid of life, remained still, untouched by the passage of time. For while the young races surged across the stars, eager to conquer and expand, the Necrons in their cold, mechanical patience watched and waited, their legacy stretching far beyond the span of any mortal empire. The Necrons were an old race, older than the Imperium of Man, older than the Eldar, older even than many of the stars that now glittered in the night sky. Once they had been the rulers of the galaxy, their empire vast and uncontested. But those days had passed, swallowed by the long sleep of millennia. And yet the Necrons had never truly left. They had never fallen as the young aces had fallen. Instead, they had slumbered, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The young aces, the humans, the elder, the oaks, and all the others, were fleeting things driven by emotion, by hunger, by ambition. They built their empires in the span of a few short centuries, waging wars over planets that the Necrons had long forgotten. To the Necrons, who measured time not in years or centuries, but in aeons, the struggles of the younger races seemed almost laughable. The humans, with their great and sprawling empire, fought endlessly to maintain control of their worlds, their armies locked in constant battle. The Elder, once proud and mighty, now clung desperately to the remnants of their civilization, their numbers dwindling with each passing age. The old cycles were intense and violent, cared for nothing but war, their endless conflicts burning bright for a moment, before fading into oblivion. To the Neocons, these episodes were like sparks, flaring up for a moment in the cold night, only to burn out and be forgotten. The machines, with their artificial bodies and eternal minds, had no such concerns. Time was on their side, and they could afford to wait. And so they did. The tomb worlds, scattered across the galaxy, remained silent. On some, the Necrons had already awakened, their legions rising from their stasis crypts to reclaim the worlds that had once been theirs. On others, the Necrons still slept, their systems waiting for the right signal, the right moment to bring them back to life. But whether they were awake or still sleeping, the Neocons shared a single purpose: to reclaim what had once been theirs. The galaxy, for all its chaos and change, still belonged to them. It had always belonged to them. The Necrons were patient. They had learned the value of patience long ago, when they had made their fateful bargain with the Catan and transformed themselves from the frail, dying Necrons into beings of living metal. In exchange for immortality, they had given up their souls, becoming something less than alive, but more than machines. And with that transformation had come a new understanding of time. The Necrons did not age. They did not grow weak or tired. They could wait for millennia, for eons, until the galaxy once again became ripe for conquest. And so, while humans built their cities and fought their wars, while the Elder whispered their prophecies and wept for their fallen kin, the Necrons waited. They watched with the cold, unfeeling gaze of beings who had seen the rise and fall of empires long before the younger races had even taken their first steps among the stars. They saw the chaos and turmoil that gripped the galaxy, the endless wars of the Imperium, the desperate struggles of the Eldar, the mindless hunger of the Tyranids, and they knew that their time would come again. For the Necrons, time was not an enemy, it was a tool. They knew that the young aces, for all their power and ambition, were doomed to fall. The Empire, vast as it was crumbling from within. Its armies stretched thin, its worlds threatened by countless enemies. The Elder, with all their wisdom and foresight, saw a dying race, their future fading with each passing generation. And the Tyranids, though they consumed all in their path, were but a force of nature, mindless and without purpose beyond survival. The Necrons, by contrast, had purpose. They had always had purpose. From the moment they had made their terrible pact with the Cetan, from the moment they had begun their war against the Old Ones. The Necrons had known what they wanted. They wanted the galaxy. And while the young aces struggled and fought over the scraps of what remained, the Necrons waited, knowing that in time, the stars would once again be theirs. Shak, the Silent King, understood this better than any. He had seen the rise and fall of the galaxy's greatest empires, had watched as the Necrons' once mighty empire crumbled into dust. He had wandered the void for millennia, seeking a way to undo the damage that had been done. But in the end, he had learned not to undo the past, but to forge a new future for his people. He knew that the Neocons could not simply reclaim their empire by force, not yet. The young heirs of all their weaknesses were still too many, too powerful. But Sile was patient. He would wait, as he had always waited for now. The ones watched. They observed the ways of the young aces, the shifting alliances, the rise and fall of kings and empires. They saw the cracks beginning to form in the great edifice of the empire, the slow, inevitable decline of the Elder, the chaos that threatened to consume the galaxy. And they waited. The galaxy had changed, but the Necrons knew the truth. The galaxy belonged to them. It had always belonged to them, and in time it would belong to them once more. For now, the Necrons were silent. Their tomb would still and dark, but the silence would not last forever. The young aces, with their fleeting lives and fragile empires, would soon learn the truth. The Necrons had not been defeated, they had not been destroyed, they had simply been waiting. And when the time was right, they would rise again, their legions marching across the stars, their cold mechanical minds set on a single goal, to reclaim their place as the rulers of the galaxy. The stars of all their brightness had dimmed, the young aces of all their ambition had begun to falter, and the Necrons, with their endless patience and their eternal purpose, were ready. The galaxy, once silent, would soon echo once more, with the sound of marching metal and the hum of ancient machines. The Neocons were waiting, and their time was coming.